can do the
Mm,
honors. All right, fire
Good.
away.
So, welcome to our series dealing with the relationship between libertarianism and conservatism. It will endure for 6 sessions, and this is the first one, and it is going to be an opening debate. We will have other sessions, will be talks, and we will have a final discussion. The series is co-organized by the Oxford Society of Metaphysics, which is a university society focused on interdisciplinary events in different kind of fields, particularly the relation between philosophy, theology, physics, worldwide student association, organizing events and campaigns on libertarian topics. So, as we said, the session will be recorded. And now I give the floor to Emanuele Martinelli, who is going to be tonight's moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. Can you hear me all right? Do you confirm that?
Yes,
All
yes.
right, that's great. So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you especially to Mark and Dan for being here with us tonight. So as said, this is the opening debate. So what I will do will be to ask a few questions, open questions to foster discussion between the speakers, and you can take your time to answer. And yeah, it's as informal as we want to make it, basically. So I will do this for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we open the floor to the audience as well to ask their questions. So no worries about that. You can already, when the Q&A is going to open, you can either use the raise your hand function here in Zoom or write in the chat and someone is going to read the question out loud. So here with us today, we have the pleasure to meet Professor Mark Pennington, who is a professor of political economy and public policy in King's College London. And before then, he was at the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary in London as well. And on the other side of the debate, we had Daniel Klein, who is a professor of economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, as well as the leader of the Adam Smith program at the George Mason University. So welcome you both. And yeah, first of all, I'd like to, well, the topic of the series is going to be the relationship between libertarianism and conservatism. So the first thing, very basic, that I'm going to ask you would be, what is your definition of libertarianism and your definition of conservatism? Who's going to start? Should we start with Mark, perhaps?
Okay. So you want me to give definitions of both of those terms?
Yeah. I mean, if you
Yeah.
like.
Okay. Well, I think it's quite difficult because I don't think there's necessarily unity within the people who would call themselves libertarians or conservatives about what those labels actually mean. So in my own case, I would call myself a libertarian, but I'm a very particular kind of libertarian. So I wouldn't put myself in the kind of Robert Nozick deontological rights-based form of libertarianism, which claims that we can derive from a kind of underlying theory of human nature a set of individual rights for people. That is an important strain in the libertarian tradition. So it grounds an account of individual freedom from some underlying theory of human nature. That is a kind of libertarianism. The kind of libertarianism I subscribe to is much more influenced by a kind of radical reading of Friedrich Hayek's ideas about the limitations of human knowledge. So it really starts from a kind of position of sort of humility, which is that we often don't know very much about the world. We don't necessarily even know much about ourselves. And in those kind of situations, it makes sense to have rules, in essence, that mean that we don't kind of impose our particular perspective on other agents. So we give the greatest possible scope for individuals to experiment with different conceptions of life, different conceptions about the kind of rules that they might live under. It's a kind of argument for a sort of radical pluralism. So individual freedom is seen to be an expression of radical pluralism on this view, and radical pluralism implies a form of individualism. But in my view, it is not a atomistic individualism that ignores the social context. It recognizes, as Hayek puts it, that individuals are always social beings. But it doesn't follow from the fact that we're social beings that we should have every aspect of our lives controlled by some governmental entity which claims to represent society. Now, I think there are some overlaps between that position and what I would call a conservative position. So I think a conservative position, as I would understand it, certainly in the kind of Edmund Burke tradition, would be one that has a kind of reverence for social rules or practices that have survived for a very long period of time. It would claim that there's some kind of social wisdom that is embedded in those rules. And because it draws on a very long historical experience, we should be very wary about tampering too much with those rules, or we should avoid a kind of radical or revolutionary sort of change. So there's a kind of reverence for established ways and practices. I don't think conservatism is opposed to change, but it would be, I think, in my view, very skeptical of radical change. So I think there's a tension between conservatives, for example, who are sympathetic to free market arguments and a kind of libertarian argument for free markets, which is very visible today. And the way I would summarize that is that free markets, in my view, generate what Schumpeter calls creative destruction. And that includes, in certain situations, destruction of social or cultural norms in ways that people might find kind of destabilizing. And I think conservatives who are concerned about free markets are concerned about the possibility that in certain circumstances, the market undermines its very own basis, precisely because it is so destabilizing. So they've got more of a concern to temper what they might see as being potentially deleterious effects of kind of unrestrained commerce or unrestrained individualism. And that could apply not just in the economic realm, they would also apply that, I think, to the realm of culture, morality, ethics, these sorts of things as well. So that's my attempt to define the dividing lines.
My take is, well, yes, both terms are very, if you will, polysemous. They have different meanings. Let me say a bit about myself. I came up through the United States libertarian movement, and in 2004, I published a piece called Mere Libertarianism, which attempted to kind of set forth my attitudes, which I proposed to call Mere Libertarianism, like in the spirit of Mere Christianity from C.S. Lewis. And it's not as though I've changed all that much since then. So in some respects, I am very comfortable calling myself a libertarian. Emmanuel kind of told me that I'm sort of wearing the conservative hat tonight, and Mark is wearing the libertarian hat, and it's supposed to be kind of a debate, and that's fine with me. But I'm not sure it's it's actually honest billing. I don't know that people who actually think of themselves as exponents of conservatism would be comfortable having someone like me as the spokesperson. Today, I most often describe my outlook as conservative liberal. And I do want to emphasize that the noun is liberal and conservative is only an adjective. So I don't actually see myself as an exponent of conservatism. I see myself more as an exponent of liberalism in the original political sense of that term. And so really, Mark and I are not that different. I mean, we probably can find our disagreements, but in some broad sense, we're like Hayek fans and Smith fans. Now, I may be more of a Burke fan. I probably am. But, it's not that different, really. So let me just also just note that conservatism, of course, is a word of much wider and varied usage. And to some extent, it just is another term for right as opposed to left. And that gets into the whole issue of left and right, actually. I tend to think the left as really a thing, and talking about leftism is meaningful. Talking about someone being a person of the left is meaningful. And right really means not left. It's much more of a coalitional and varied group that's not the friends and supporters of the left, and hence they get called right or conservative. So there's that very broad thing to keep in mind, but in as much as it's a term that I want to affirm and use, as I do use as an adjective, and even espouse as an adjective on my main thing, which is liberalism, what does I think a good way to think about it is, what does conservatism in conserve? So what is the word let's try to do something with that word rather than it being a mere code word. Well, one thing it might conserve is classical liberalism, is the original arc of liberalism that came out of Europe, Christendom, and had a sort of liberal era represented, I would say, with sort of Adam Smith at a crest and on through, say, Gladstone. Um, so in a sense, it's conserving liberalism. So that's kind of an irony. Maybe you could say it's conserving liberal democracy, Western civilization. I would also say Christian moral intuitions fits in here as something that conservatism wants to conserve, and which I think is actually essential to Western liberalism. I think Christianity made liberalism possible. What else might conservatism be conserving? I think an important thing is stable, functional polity, which is a kind of precondition for orderly and sensible and intelligent policy reformation. Polity versus policy. And we shouldn't take stable, functional polity with a kind of halfway reasonable and honest government, halfway free and honest elections, and other institutions for granted. And things like mass immigration figure into this aspect significantly. It could also be, even in the policy realm itself, a certain respect for the status quo. In other words, just as libertarians like Mark and I want to give liberty a large presumption, a benefit of the doubt, I do think there's cause for some presumption to the status quo. What that implies for liberty is varied if it is an augmentation of government interference that someone is proposing. Actually, the liberty presumption and the status quo presumption stand together shoulder by shoulder against bigger government. But if it's a liberalization that is the reform, then there's a tension between the two presumptions. I still think, like the status quo, inherently, necessarily enjoys a certain degree of presumption. Let me also just finally add, this is a little bit of my opening. I prepared some notes here. I'm almost done. Conservatism, in comparison to libertarianism, has more the spirit of religion, meaning the spirit of a beholder like God. And I think that's significant. And I just think that sociologically, practically, when you meet people, and some of them call themselves conservatives and some of them call themselves libertarians, like usually the libertarians are pretty godless and the conservatives are pretty godly. And that's just like an important aspect of it. And I think in many respects that's a plus for the conservatives, because I'm rather bullish on the spirit of religion, even though I myself am an agnostic.
All right, that's great. That's great. And sure. So, well, just a follow-up to Dan. I guess that he lives, for context, in the US, but also visits Europe and Sweden in particular on a regular basis. And of course, when you say that conservatives are on a par with libertarians in the sense that they oppose bigger government, as opposed, for instance, to leftist movements or ideas, would you say the same is true also for European conservatism at large? Because as a European, I can sense that at least at the level of political discourse, there are many conservative politicians that, for the sake of defending tradition and social cohesion, they oppose the idea that a purely liberty-based framework is sufficient for the well-being of society, and therefore they call for supporting bigger government in the form of protecting borders or defending poorer classes because they represent the true spirit of the nation or something like that. That's a little bit absent maybe in the American conservatism, and for sure, actually. But what would you say to that? And to open it up to, yeah.
Did you want me to
Go
reply
on.
back?
Yeah,
Um,
why not?
First of all, I think American conservative fits that description also. I mean, in the similar way to Europe, which I don't pretend to know so well. And on immigration, you're absolutely right. Um, I would go back and just say that again, conservatism or conservative is more of a catch-all expression, and it's sort of anything that's not allied with the left often gets called right, and hence conservative. I mean, I do think there are plenty of people who self-describe as conservative in Europe and here that are pretty wise to government and pretty opposed to the further or to the governmentalization of social affairs. So I think it's a mixed bag, really.
All right, understandable. And I don't know if Marx would like to jump in on this, or maybe on what is the role of tradition or social cohesion for a libertarian, for instance, if liberty or freedom is really sufficient to guarantee what at least the people would expect being the welfare of a functioning society.
So I think there is a role for tradition, but I would want to say, in terms of the relationship between tradition and institutions of the state, it's a relatively thin connection. So you need, for any functioning society, for there to be some basic rules of interaction that people respect almost automatically without constantly needing to be sort of checked up. And tradition is a part of that. Now, in my view, if we look historically, the traditions or basic norms that are essential are things like rule of law, private property rights, those kind of things. You don't steal, you don't kill. They're basic norms of interaction. Now, within a framework where you have those norms that are, in a sense, traditional, you can also have people pursuing, if you like, thicker traditions that are associated with religion or other sorts of values. You could include environmentalism, which arguably is a kind of religion, in the mix. So I think it really depends what sort of layer you're looking at. Libertarianism, as I understand it, is not opposed to religion. It's not opposed to tradition. What it would be concerned about is too much of an alignment between certain kinds of traditions and the state. That's where I think the dividing line would be. And you do see, I think, in European conservatism and in US conservatism, an attempt to have a kind of spiritual quality which is attached to the state. Now, what goes into that spiritualism varies, but there is an attempt to ground the state on a kind of spiritual foundation, which I think is often a kind of, I guess I would say this, a kind of crude romanticism, which doesn't really bear that much scrutiny.
Right. And yeah, that's actually very interesting. And one of the things that caught my attention immediately was your statement that environmentalism could be a kind of religion. some sense. And yeah, we have just said, actually, both of you, that one element of conservatism is, attaching a spiritual dimension to the state, or at least being more grounded into a religious tradition, and then also talked about Christian values in particular. But of course, I cannot speak for all countries around, but when you see more or less conservative politicians uh, usually are those that campaign either against environmentalism or are more, I don't know, tuned a little bit lower on environmentalism. So would you, Mark, and then Dan can also say his opinion, say that that is because I don't know, focusing too much on values that could have a spiritual value potential, such as environmentalism, is detrimental to the narrative that I don't know, the nation of this or society or the values of society are grounded in Christian values? Or would you say there's another reason why conservative politicians, for instance, I don't know, Trump or Orban or or other conservative politicians, for instance, are more skeptical of environmentalism?
There's an awful lot in that question. I think, let me try and get at different dimensions of it. So I think one reason why conservatives, and I actually think this is true of, this has been my own view as well, coming from a more libertarian position, are suspicious of some forms of environmentalism, though not necessarily all, is that if you look at the ideas that have informed large parts of the green movement, they are actually revolutionary ideas. And revolutionary ideas are not about individual freedom, but about some notion of collective freedom. They're socialistic ideas. So eco-socialism is very, very influential in the Western green movement. I would say it's the dominant tradition. There are more conservative strands of environmentalism, but the ones that are prevalent, for example, in the UK Green Party at the moment, which is proposing policies that are very similar to Jeremy Corbyn's, then it's the idea of overthrowing capitalism that actually animates many of those people. Now, I think there could be a form of environmentalism, which is where people just want to live a simpler life. They don't want to have everything commercialized or commodified, which is compatible with a liberal society and with libertarianism, where people choose a particular form of life, almost like a monastic life, a simple life, as a way in which they're expressing their individuality or a particular ethical project that they want to pursue. And within a liberal society, that should be possible, as well as pursuing any other religion or no religion at all. The problem, I think, from the sort of classical liberal or libertarian viewpoint is you don't want the state to be involved in that, precisely because people coming from these different religious or spiritual traditions are going to have different views about the good life. They're going to come into conflict. So you're going to want the state to act as an organization which resolves disputes when those different traditions come into conflict. But if the state itself comes to represent one of those traditions, whether it's Christianity, environmentalism, or anything else, then it's going to be experienced as a kind of oppressive force for those people who disagree with the particular spirituality concerned. So that is the concern about having the state involved in a kind of spiritual level.
Let me follow up. In a way, I think that all ideological outlooks have almost a spiritual element. I think spiritual elements suffuse a lot of our discussion of groups and institutions when we talk about societies and so on. And I would even call my own outlook as, in some respects, quasi-religious, because I don't actually affirm a deity in it. But it does affect my own notions about the higher things of my life, higher pursuits, higher meaning, worthiness, virtue. it does affect those things. And that's what I kind of mean by quasi-religious, the high things, which in a religious view are sort of godly, maybe sacred things. Um, so I kind of see all ideological outlooks as quasi-religious. I see many outlooks, especially in leftism and its varieties like enviro stuff, as well, obviously strong quasi-religions, and also something which affects people's notions of higher things way too much. The way that in a liberal view, the liberal spirit affects the higher things is mainly cordoning off part of the higher things space and saying, don't go over there. That's not good. Don't go over there. You are left over here in the higher things, and you have to make the most of it. That's your responsibility, which is exactly why a lot of people don't take to it, because they want something more conformist or directed or manifest. And I think a lot of people of the conservatives, now to kind of get back to your question, they see that one of their big objections to all this enviro stuff is not just that it doesn't work and it's expensive and it ruins a lot of things in society, but that it's really a state promotion of a different quasi-religious outlook, which crowds and even is jealous of, for example, a traditional Christian religious outlook or other religious outlooks. Um, and as far as so I definitely understand why a lot of conservatives, especially if they're sort of faith-based, are very, very opposed to these kind of political religions, if you like, much along the lines of what Alexis de Tocqueville warned us about. Um, Let me just say that, I do think that when we talk about a stable functional polity, there is a spirit to that. So in some ways, I actually embrace a spiritual approach to the state. It's just that I want it to be a liberal spirit. Like, in some sense, my heroes, Hume, Smith, Burke, they didn't fight the nation state. They saw that it was emerging and sort of destined, that we were sort of fated to it. And their effort was, let's make it a liberal nation state. And similarly, sort of the spirit of the government, the polity, the state, they want it to be a more liberal spirit. Um, and I think they contributed mightily to that. So I don't know how that fits in exactly, but those are some thoughts.
Yeah, they were great, both of you actually. So yeah, and the next question that I'd like to ask you is if there are any cultural or moral norms that, according to you, the society or the government should actively preserve. Whoever wants to come first, I don't know.
For me, there are, but they're very minimal. So you shouldn't kill people. You shouldn't steal from people. You also, I think it's reasonable for organizations like the state to say that there is a kind of public realm that, there should be kind of basic form of respect for, that recognize that there are people with different beliefs and values that might come into contestation. So maybe that could overlap with what Dan's referring to as a kind of liberal spirituality, that, we do want to have a spirit of toleration in a society. But beyond that, I wouldn't want the state to be the organization which is inculcating values. So they're a very thin set of values that I think do need to be reinforced. And that's pretty well
it. I agree. And when you say the state promoting, it's a question of kind of, you want your political players to embody, the hope is, right? The wish to embody virtue writ large. But And so in that sense, they are setting examples, you would hope, like maybe Margaret Thatcher to some extent. I don't know, maybe William Gladstone to some extent, maybe Edmund Burke to some extent, who was a parliamentarian for about 30 years. Um, so in that sense, there's moral promotion by the state. Um, but I agree with Mark that, it shouldn't be any kind of very activist social, cultural agenda. Um, I think everybody wishes we were at a place where political actors were promoting, and this gets back to the stable functional polity part. We're kind of promoting and sustaining certain traditional political norms, kind of the norms and interaction that underlie basic policy making and policy discussion and so forth, and the sort of surface level operations of government. And so you would want to try to preserve the again this kind of preconditions or substratum of norms that make for stable functional polity. So in that sense, there's a cultural agenda, I suppose. But basically, I don't think the government ought to be doing much. They can maybe, I do think maybe classical liberals, conservatives, whoever, maybe have a cultural battle in government policy to play, a role to play in terms of fighting off other cultural agendas. Because the left, for example, and not only the left, because remember the left I'm not too happy with, but there's plenty I'm not happy with on the non-left, the so-called right. So there too. But the left, for example, very much has cultural agendas, big time. Big time indoctrination, propaganda, censorship, persecution, election interference, and so on. And so, fighting that is a kind of cultural battle.
All right. I think that you both touch on something quite profound, that is the relationship that both libertarianism and conservatism can have with universal moral claims and moral values. Because, I mean, in the political discourse, usually things are framed to say that conservative politicians and conservative philosophers, for instance, are maybe really attached to defending certain moral claims that are universal, or moral values such as the values of Christianity, or I don't know, in another country it could be Sharia law for conserving whatever morality and spirituality there's in Arab countries, or even in more secular societies, I guess, that conservative politicians might want to preserve a certain nation's way of life, or I don't know, ban abortion, for instance, because it is said to be universally morally unacceptable, or banning drugs because the use of drugs is immoral. Whereas the classic libertarian claim would be that things that may be immoral shouldn't necessarily be outlawed because, for instance, it may be the case that it is immoral to do drugs, but the state shouldn't interfere with individual freedom to do drugs or doing something that is immoral. And yet, what has been said until now is that even libertarians have universal moral claims, of course, and values that, well, should be preserved and promoted, such as, basic liberties, for instance, don't kill or don't steal, or the protection of fundamental property rights and rights to liberty, life, and property right. So, would you say which one is more bound to universal moral claims and values, conservatism or libertarianism in the end?
So, from my point of view, I find it quite surprising that you say that conservatives believe in universal moral values, because my reading is actually very different. I think the conservative position is much more, certainly, I'm thinking more of a, and I guess he is more of a liberal conservative actually, but somebody like Michael Oakeshott, who I think has been a conservative thinker, and I would probably say maybe even Edmund Burke as well, they are be conservatives who'd be saying life is very uncertain. When people have discovered a set of practices, perhaps accidentally, that seem to work, that may have some kind of aesthetic attraction to them, then they are worth conserving, but not because they represent some kind of universal human nature that are necessarily applicable all across the world. So I think that kind of conservative actually would not be saying that, you know, people in the United States or in Europe should try to convert, for example, people in other cultures to the European religion or the American religion, because I think they would actually be skeptical of the idea that there is a kind of universal set of practices. And they'd be wanting to say that we just want to defend our practices where we live because we think they're valuable. So in that sense, I think you could make an argument that even though it's committed to this very thin set of moral rules that I've been emphasizing, libertarianism is a bit closer to the universalist view than conservatism. I feel slightly uneasy about that because I myself don't see myself as someone who's a kind of universalist thinker. I'm actually quite sympathetic to a lot of sort of postmodernist kind of arguments, actually, about cultural pluralism. But I kind of see the thin set of norms that I was emphasizing as what allows that to go ahead. But I don't see those norms as reflecting a kind of universal human nature. I see them more as something that, through demonstrated practice, enables people who disagree with each other to kind of coexist. You disagree about human nature to coexist.
Let me speak up a little bit for universal human nature. Humankind, which I think is in some sense the supreme good, like the good of the whole, the good of the whole of humankind, including future generations, is constituted actually in individual organisms. And there is things about the way we're constituted that are very human nature. And David Hume wrote about this. It was called The Treatise of Human Nature. And there's something natural and special about the knowledge and control I, Dan, have over this thing, right? This hand. I can move it and do things with it much better than anyone else can. If I hit it with a hammer, I have much more of a reaction to that than anyone else does. And there's a sort of natural property then in my ownership of my hand and the rest of my body, and we might even say the rest of my mind or my person. In a sense, and this is, again, where I kind of think spiritualism and Christian pattern is very valuable. I think of us as souls, and we own a person. And I like the universalism of that and affirm it. And one thing that Hume and Smith teach is that any society where neighbors kind of routinely mess with each other's stuff is not going anywhere. In other words, some degree of respect for each other's stuff is indispensable, to use Adam Smith's word, for the society to get on and to get to, for example, 17th century, 1700s Scotland. And so there is a universalism, first of all, in that, in human nature. Another theme, let me suggest, is kind of dissolving some of these distinctions between, for example, universalism and what would we say, civilizationalism or relativism or historicism. And that's that the idea of the impartial spectator in Adam Smith, which is in its highest sense a godlike being or God itself, is universal. It's a universal point of view. However, in its super knowledge, it sees and understands the historical context, which affects how behavior within such context is to be judged by God and by us. So there's a way to kind of there's a way to go kind of both and, that is to say, sort of both historical or historicist and universalist, both civilizationalist and universalist. And this is like a theme. This is like a theme for me in Smith, where he is both deontological and consequentialist, both natural and conventional, and things like that. And so I can kind of see Mark as a universalist it's not hard for me to see the universalism in people's thought. I think actually we're kind of, whether we know it or not, subconscious beholderists, where we kind of think about a universal view of humankind in coming to our judgments about things. So those are, I don't know, those are some thoughts of mine.
Yeah, those are great. And yeah, thank you very much for sharing your ideas. I think it is now a good time to open up to questions from the audience. So as said, you can either raise your hand or write in the chat. And yeah, just go ahead. I mean, if people are too shy, I do have some more questions for you, but it was nice to give the opportunity to somebody else, I guess. All right, so I guess that in the meantime, maybe I ask you another couple of questions, unless you guys wanted to respond to one another or to add some comments on your own. Otherwise, I go
Well, I
ahead.
just spoke. So, Mark, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess just thinking about, just responding more directly to your view about, I know that in the Smith's literature, there is a lot of controversy about, what role God plays, but I've always understood the impartial spectator as not being a godlike figure, but almost what we call the impartial spectator is actually an emergent property from the interaction of many actors within society. So what we think the impartial spectator would be thinking about particular situations, it's not like a godlike entity. It's more something like an inherited wisdom that's arisen through interactions of many, many different spectators, actually, that there isn't any single spectator. And I guess this gets to the tension I see between contemporary conservatism and libertarianism, which is that Smith also reserves a place for what he calls, as I understand it, like the man in the breast, which is the kind of inner sense or the individual's willingness, actually, in some cases, to challenge what is considered to be the conventional morality. So we're all born into cultural circumstances where the spectator might say that we ought to do a certain thing, or public opinion might say that we ought to do a certain thing. But we actually think it's wrong. Well, we want to challenge it. We want to do something different. We want to be, in essence, a moral entrepreneur. And this gets back to the point that I raised at the beginning about there's a kind of destructive aspect to entrepreneurship in that sense, whether it's in the economic realm, the religious realm, or any other realm, that it is destabilizing of what people currently think to be the accepted practice. And I see libertarianism, in a sense, as celebrating the disruption, because it's through that disruption that new possibilities arise in a kind of open-ended, never-ending process. And I see conservatism as being skeptical of that it sees that kind of attitude as being a kind of hubris, which can lead to actually societal breakdown rather than societal progress. So those were just my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that last part sounds right to me. Let me go back to what you say about Smith and the expression impartial spectator. This is something I'm very, very involved in, by the way.
Mm.
Um, so the expression impartial spectator has to be seen as having, again, multiple meanings, as polysemous. And I say it does run up to God or a godlike being. And so it's both and. So you're right, but it's not, that doesn't mean it's not God. It's just like you have to, the challenge in Smith and Hume as well is often to kind of sort through the meanings and see which thing they mean at each instance of the text. And Smith, in fact, in one very important, what I consider a very important passage, explicitly distinguishes the impartial spectator, which I take in that case to be the godlike meaning, and the man within the breast. And not only does he distinguish them, but he describes the relationship between them. He says the man within the breast, which, by the way, is just understand is just his expression for the conscience.
Yeah.
So your conscience is a representative of the man, of the impartial spectator. Now, it's not necessarily a good representative, and it is unique. It is individuated, right? So we're all got different points of view, just like you say. And that is where cultural and moral innovation sort of resides, is when you cultivate an innovative man within the breast. That's sort of the form of a new product, as it were, in the moral space, is like a new conscience. Um, but I'm just saying, I very much say that Smith is what I call a beholderist. Whether he's a theist, I don't even have a strong opinion about that. But whether he is or is not, I say he is a beholderist, and he is actually working with a concept of a universal being who is super knowledgeable, like way beyond human knowledge, and is universally benevolent. That is to say, like in the Christian tradition, God loves all of his creatures. Um, so so anyway, that's a bit about that. Again, I am very keen on this both and kind of move when we say, oh, is Smith this or is Smith that, or is proper liberal attitudes? Because my view of a proper liberal or conservative liberal attitude is Smith, or at least my interpretation of Smith. And so I'm very both and sort of, we need, just like we need two wings to fly, we often need both to fly, both universalism and historicism, both deontology and consequentialism, and so forth.
There is a question in the box that I think is
Yeah.
a good one to respond to. So this is about how do market-driven expansions of LGBTQ visibility and consumer recognition expose tensions between libertarian commitments to individual freedom and conservative commitments to traditional social norms. So from my point of view, this is a reason why we should be very wary of arguments about human nature, because if you went back 30 or 40 years ago, people in the conservative movement in the UK and in the United States were saying that homosexuality, gayness, queerness, whatever you want to call it, should be controlled, if not prohibited, precisely because they believed it was unnatural, or that if it was natural, it was a natural defect that needed to be corrected. And that was incredibly oppressive to many people who just wanted to go on living their lives in the way they wanted to, with the people they wanted to. So that, for me, is a very strong example of how you actually need moral entrepreneurs. In this case, people who are campaigning for more sexual freedom to disrupt social norms. There's nothing wrong with conservative people wanting to live by their norms and standards, but they really shouldn't try to impose them on other people in the name of some human nature or some universal set of values, which to me is very often the enemy of freedom. And in this case, I think maybe what the question is getting at is that market-driven activities, commerce in this case, has actually been disruptive of religious practice or religious norms in ways that have been very liberating for an awful lot of people. And that is something to be celebrated.
Let me follow up on that. About Marx's wariness, he says he's wary of arguments about human nature, and this to me parallels, wariness among many of my libertarian and Austrian economics friends about wariness about talk of the good of the whole, or for that matter, talk of this universal benevolent beholder, wariness about social aggregation in some ethical sense. And I think that those are platitudes which actually we should embrace, and we have to face them as basic, actually supreme, like the good of the whole is actually the supreme good. And our criticism, our approach when we hear people invoke things about human nature to pry in and suppress people's private lives, ought to be not, oh, it's not proper to argue in terms of human nature, but basically to say you're getting human nature wrong, or you're getting the good of the whole wrong. In other words, don't be wary about human nature, the good of the whole, and other platitudes, but rather say they're getting them wrong, which I think you can argue in terms of, the state interfering in people's private choices in that fashion. That would be my attitude. I don't know how it fits into libertarian and conservative, but anyhow.
All right. Yep. So if there are any more questions, feel free. And if Vinayakan in the chat wanted to follow up, feel free as well.
Come on, people. Are you out there? Are you listening? You must have something to ask or say. We want to hear from you.
All right. Yeah, at the risk of finishing with a very superficial question, I wanted just to shoot it to no, wait. Before, let's give the priority to the audience then. So we have Paraskeva, sorry for the pronunciation, asking, so are human rights individual and inalienable, or are they revocable for the good of the many?
Revocable.
Mm.
I mean, they have very strong presumptions, but there are exceptions. You can always dream up exceptional circumstances. People do it too readily. But yeah, I mean, the good of the whole is supreme. My allegiance to individual liberty, is based on the good of the whole, or arguments about the good of the whole. At least I like to think so.
So I find this question very hard to answer. So I think rights in a practical sense are not always individual. So there are societies that, even in terms of property, emphasize various sort of collective structures. So the kind of things that Eleanor Ostrom talks about, for example, they're not based on individual rights as such. They're based on a somewhat more collective conception of property. So from my view, from a kind of libertarian standpoint, what you want is a pluralism of rights constructions, which individuals can kind of move in between the gaps of, that they can see different understandings of rights or different ways of living. So it's a kind of radical pluralism, and you need what you might call rights to enable that pluralism to go forward. But the rights are not grounded in some notion of an inalienable human nature. They're grounded in the need to cope with the fact that people disagree actually about things like human nature, as well as multiple other things.
Might use the word defeasible and indefeasible here. And I'm saying that, my right to my own person and property is defeasible rather than indefeasible, which is to say we could dream up cases where, you know, my property should be abused, should be coerced against and stolen or killed or whatever. But that's not normal. And so we want to talk more generally about what works and what's good and so forth.
We got
a follow-up.
Yeah.
You wanted to read it?
If a Christian communist said that we must have communism so that we all may go to heaven for everyone's best interest, then you'd have no moral defense against them. I would have a defense against them. I would just say that I disagree with your ethical claim. And I'd want to sort of fight back against you if you attempted to impose it upon me. But I wouldn't be doing that out of a belief that I have some ultimate interior human nature that has to be protected. Because part of the dispute I'm having with the Christian communist is precisely about the content of that human nature.
I would try to unpack his vision of why he thinks that, and then try to challenge whatever sort of causality he is seeing, and the way he's making use of words. Yeah, I'm not even sure what the statement's exactly supposed to mean, but anyhow.
Right. So I'm conscious of time, so I say we finish with one slogan question. If I had to ask you, where do you position libertarianism? Would you say it is a right-wing political position, or even a left-wing political position, or something else entirely? And right-wing and left-wing are status in their own way.
I mean, I certainly would not position it as right or left. So I see it as being about tolerating, as I said at the beginning, a kind of radical pluralism. And in different ways, the right and the left, as I understand them today, at any rate, are actually opposed to that pluralism. So on the sort of post-liberal right, you've got people who are basically opposed to various freedoms that people have fought for, like freedoms of women, freedom for gays and lesbians, freedom of various ethnic groups, etc. But on the left of politics, you have people who are unwilling to tolerate people who have different views on income redistribution, climate change, environmental questions, all of these cultural types questions as well. They want to impose a particular view. So in different ways, the right and the left, as I see them today, they're committed to social control. Libertarianism, as I understand it, is committed to kind of radical pluralism, which wants to limit social control. So it's neither left nor right in that sense.
I tend to see and use right and left in a kind of pragmatic political way. And I see politics very, very much as a matter of lesser evil. I also have this interpretation of, like I've mentioned, left and right, where like left is a thing. Historically you can talk about when people really started using left in the broad-based way around 1900 and going forward. And right again is kind of non-left, and kind of deferring to that convention and usage, which I don't wish to fight really, right and left and right, and it's the way it is, and I want to participate in it kind of as a matter of civic virtue. I would say, well, I'm non-left and I'm on the right, and I think coalitionally, broadly speaking, I have more hope for non-left actors to mitigate the situation. I've voted twice for Donald Trump. I generally vote Republican. I'm rooting for example, the off day in Germany. I have all sorts of opinions about Europe, by the way, and Brussels. Talk about the greater evil. Um, so, I mean, at the end of the day, I would say it's on the right, not because I make a big deal about like right being something important or meaningful, but just that that's the way the scheme works. And it's, for me, not left. And I do believe in this coalitionalism, and that, like Benjamin Constant wrote about ancient and modern liberty being more or less individual liberty as we libertarians think of it, and ancient liberty being your participation in public affairs and your right to do that. And he totally emphasized, libertarians often neglect this, but he ends that piece by emphasizing the importance of exercising your ancient liberty, and that without our doing so, modern liberty won't be sustained.
Amazing. So I'd say this is a good time to close the session, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you very much both for your contributions. And all right, so thank you very much again to Dan and Mark. And we're meeting with the next section next week, March 4th, with the first of a series of standalone talks, actually, and before the closing debate. So thank you very much, you both, for participating, and to the audience generally for being here.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye.
All
Bye.
day.